Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. This is our tour through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book, and author by author, era by era. And ordinarily I would start this video with a nice up-close facial of my little schnauzer Frida, who is sound asleep on the bed, squarely behind my back. And right before I was ready to hit record, I turned around and said, "Bean," and she lifted her head. She was all tucked into her little semicolon. She lifted her head and looked at me. I said, "Do you want to be on a video? Do you want to get up on my lap?" And she just said no and just resolutely stuck her head back down into her curled position. So she will not be appearing in this video as a pretty matter-of-fact display of indifference. The star cannot be bothered today. But we have been seeing the wide variety of penguins here. We've been dealing with individual volumes. We've been dealing with well-known volumes, household name volumes. We've been dealing sometimes with shelf-clearing episodes where we get many books done in one video. And I've mentioned a few times lately here in September that is fruitless because we cannot get all the way to the end in this year. It's not possible. We're in 7th or 8th of September right now, and around the 7th or 8th of December I'm going to be wrapping up shop here at this channel for the end of the year, and that gives us what, September, October, November, December. That gives us 4 months. Realistically speaking, I'm not going to get a book done every one of those days. I don't think it's likely that we're going to finish this Penguin wall in 2020, but today we have big fat anthology. We haven't had enough of those. I don't think Penguin Classic makes enough of those. But this is a great one. Absolutely great. This is the Penguin Book of Irish Poetry in a huge volume. This is edited by Patrick Crotty, who does a really good job finding these poems over the course of 1,500, 2,000 years and organizing them in ways that allow for overlap. There are different time periods, different categories, different schools of Irish poetry, and they are not sequential, not strictly so. So the same poet can crop up in a couple of different sections, and that really works. It will work less if your editor is not on the job, but this editor is fantastic. And the foreword to this book is by Seamus Heaney, one of the greatest Irish poets of recent memory. And he is also liberally represented in the table of contents, which I ordinarily would rail against, except I'm not 100% sure that it was his idea. I could easily see, since he has name recognition in poetry, and especially in Irish poetry, I could easily see the editors coming to him and saying, "Well, we'd like to liberally represent your poetry in the table of contents here." Not only because we like it, but also for strictly commercial reasons. And I could easily picture something like that happening. I'm not 100% sure that he would be the type that would have insisted. But one way or another, the sheer spectrum that's covered here is amazing. And Seamus Heaney's preface is amazing as well in another way, because it is a work of scholarship. It is absolutely fantastic and steeply serious as a preface to a volume of poetry. And the reason I might sound a little incredulous about that is because ordinarily, in the normal course of events, if you got a poet, we'll have to see if that is the presage to 4 hours of miserable, completely unconscious, blood-spattering, compulsive sneezing every 25 seconds for 4 straight hours until all I want is for someone to murder me, or if it was just 2 random sneezes. I don't know anymore. This whole summer I haven't known. Is it just 2 random sneezes, or am I going to lose a whole day? Am I going to be writing apology letters to editors the next day saying, "I'm sorry I missed my deadline," because I'm just sitting on the edge of a chair blasting a sneeze every 25 seconds? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But the fact that Seamus Heaney's preface to this volume is so good, quite apart from how good his poetry is in the course of this volume and how good the poetry is of so many other people in this volume, speaks to something that I'm going to try and keep under control in this Daily Penguin, which is how best to put it so as not to stomp on delicate feelings. In our 21st century, in 2020, we're surrounded on all sides by incredibly delicate feelings. People are so ready to be mortally offended. the point I'm trying to make here is that the literary capacity of Ireland is significantly greater than its geographic extent. Is that diplomatic enough way to put it? The Irish are naturals at literature. Virtually any one of the named, there's quite a bit of anonymous work in this book, but virtually any one of the named poets in this anthology could, if you gave them enough time, if you gave them a month or so, have produced a preface every bit as steeply intelligent and conversant with the literature as Seamus Heaney's was for this volume. And I would argue, gently, again, of course, in deference to snowflakes everywhere, I would argue that not every literary nationality could have that be true. I'm trying to tread very delicately here. What I'm trying to say is that Ireland is a place steeped in literature, and a place that values it, a place that places a high premium on a man or a woman telling you on a street corner that they are a poet. In a great many countries in the world, that would be viewed as a poncy, mockable thing to say. Of course, in most parts of the United States, it would lead to a gun homicide. That would be not only a cause for you to be shot dead multiple times on the street by the person you had just told it to, but in most of the court systems in America, it would be viewed as justified. The person wouldn't go spend a day in jail. In fact, they might get a parade. So you have you have the whole of the spectrum. But in Ireland, even today, even in the Ireland today, Ireland had an experience years ago called the Emerald Tiger. And an old friend of mine, who's not completely unconnected with this anthology, told me at the time, I said, wow, this is incredible, isn't it? It's an economic revival, the likes of which no one expected to see in our lifetime. And he said, well, yes, the money's in and the brains are out. So I'm not 100% sure that on the streets of a major Irish city today, if you said, well, if someone said, what do you do? And you said, I'm a poet, I'm not 100% sure it would get the reaction that it would have gotten before then. But my point is, it would have gotten the reaction that it would have had before then, it would have had for 2,000 years before then. That's a serious literary heritage, and it is amazingly reflected in this book. There is just something in here for everybody. Heaney, in his preface, makes a decided point about the editor's decision not to exclude works of Irish poetry that are heavily influenced by England, for instance. Not to call it a sham or the muling of the conquered. That instead, poetic genius can refine any tools, and it can speak in any language. I like that about this volume, and I want to, because this is Poetry Tuesday, I want to read you some examples from this volume. I can't really speak about it in any way except to recommend it. This is an incredible anthology of Irish verse. There are only a handful of those in the English language. In fact, Heaney mentions, I think with a guilty conscience, he mentions two of the others at the end, three of the others: the Penguin Book of Irish Verse from 1970, the Faber Book of Irish Verse from 1974, and the New Oxford Book of Irish Verse from 1986. He mentions those, and he mentions them favorably. So those are other anthologies. I think I have one of those. I think I have the Oxford book, but this is my preferred one. For the plenitude and for the willingness to include things that quite a few earlier Irish poetry anthologies would have considered sellouts or unseemly to be put alongside the poetry of the oppressed, the poetry of for a great many years in its history, the Irish people have been oppressed. It's good, I think, that this, and I'm trying to thread my words carefully. As you can tell, I'm not very good at that. I'm not very good at it at all. I probably shouldn't care, right? If you're listening, then you're willing to take what I say. And if you're new and you're looking for a fight, well, you'll find plenty of them on this channel. So I don't know that there's any good to be got from being delicate. I'm trying to be. I have a horse in the race here, of course. I am of unmixed Irish descent. On my father's side and my Sainted Ma's side, going all the way back to the Battle of the Boyne. So I have a bit of a horse in the race. There's that, and there's also the fact that I have lived in Ireland. The west coast of Ireland is a place up in Donegal, is a place where I lived. I've traveled pretty much everywhere in the world, with one notable exception. But I have only lived in about 2 dozen places, and Donegal is one of those places. So where I live, I mean where I'm staying, where I'm not a tourist. I'm hunkering down. So I'm trying to compensate here, because this is a very personal anthology. It feels far more directly connected to me than any other. I mean, I've had the men in on both sides of my family were gruff, bulbous-nosed, hard-handed workers, and yet if you had mentioned to them that some new member of the family was a poet, they would have been quiet and respectful. It meant something to be a poet, or to have a love of the written word. In my father's generation of the family, that love started to become more acceptable. You started to be able to make money off it and hold your head up about it. So my father was briefly able to do it. I am able to do it. And those horses in the race have led me to have a natural soft spot for what I view as the Irish facility with the language, that I believe is noticeable. I believe it is marked and in advance of quite a few other places. I'm trying to be gentle. That's as close as I can say. Instead, let's just read some poetry together, shall we, to get out of trouble? Let's just read some poetry. I have 3 poems that I want to read to you. And the first one is from the early 19th century. The poet is John Philpot Curran, who was born in 1750. And this is an example of what I'm talking about, where something is metrically tight, metrically solid, where something that looks very much to the verse of England and hardly at all to the verse of Ireland. Certainly in terms of the local rhythms of the Irish, of the language, or in terms of mythology and folklore, which you will find all over the place in later poets. The nationalist movement very much embraced literature, so that you have a time there where Irish writers felt that it was almost unbecoming if they didn't steep their work in the past, and we're going to get to that in one of these poems. But this is very different. This is something that if I took Curran's name off this and gave you some versifier from London at the time, you wouldn't effectively be able to know the difference, despite the fact that the poem is called The Deserter's Meditation. You could take that name off it as well, because there's nothing of that in the poem. But it's still delightful, and I wanted to share it with you, just in case you've never encountered this poet before. And you're going to notice right away, I apologize for my poetry reading skills, or lack thereof, but you're going to notice right away a particular rhyme scheme here that is utterly delightful. Not enough poets can master it. If sadly thinking, with spirits sinking, could, more than drinking, my cares compose, a cure for sorrow from sighs I'd borrow, and hope tomorrow would end my woes. But as in wailing there's not availing, and death unfailing will strike the blow, then for that reason, and for a season, let us be merry before we go. To joy a stranger, a way-worn ranger, in every danger my course I've run. Now hope all ending, and death befriending, his last aid lending, my cares are done. No more a rover or hapless lover, my griefs are over, my glass runs low. Then for that reason, and for a season, let us be merry before we go. I think that's terrific. And we will move on now to that bit about looking to the past, which in the early part of the 20th century was de rigueur for Irish literature, for Irish drama, especially for Irish poetry, and then in later years was viewed with a kind of cynicism by a later generation of poets. And the poet that I want to read here is Eavan Boland, who just died just recently, and who was a terrifically powerful literary figure. Eavan's poetry, this poetry is amazing. I suggest getting a big volume of it and just losing yourself in it. And I suspect that sometime next year, or maybe the year after that, there will be an enormous annotated volume of complete poetry. I don't think a complete poems exists for this author, but I feel certain that it will. And this is a poem that looks back and forward. That is all about the past. I won't go back to it. My nation displaced into old dactyls, oaths made by animal tallows of the candle, land of the Gulf Stream, the small farm, the scalded memory, the songs that bandage up the history, the words that make a rhythm of a crime. Where time is time past, a palsy of regrets. No, I won't go back. My roots are brutal. I am the woman, a sloven's mix of silk at the wrists, a sort of dove strut in the precincts of the garrison, who practices the quick frictions, the rictus of delight, and gets cambric for it, rice-colored silks. I am the woman, in Gansey coat, on board the Mary Bell, in the huddling cold, holding her half-dead baby to her as the wind shifts east and north over the dirty waters of the wharf, mingling the immigrant guttural with the vowels of homesickness, who neither knows nor cares that a new language is a kind of scar and heals after a while into a passable imitation of what went before. And there you see a very, very violent rejection of the romanticism of the past. And part and parcel with that, of course, that features prominently in the last 200 years of Irish literature, the immigrant experience. I want to read you one other long poem, but first a little couplet here that's right next to that. It's by Paul Durkin, who was born in 1944. And its title is Ireland 1972, and it conveys in one couplet quite a bit, quite a bit. Next to the fresh grave of my beloved grandmother, the grave of my first love, murdered by my brother. And then to finish up here, we will go to the master of ceremonies himself. We'll go to Seamus Heaney, who writes a poem I lived on the west coast of Ireland, and I traveled all over the country in enormous loops and detailed excursions. This was a very, very long time ago. It's possible that if you went to some small west coast of Ireland village in Donegal and asked the oldest person at the bar, do you remember a strange person? It would do you no good to say American, because in the entire time I was there, no one suspected that I was American. But do you remember a stranger who came here with his ankles surrounded by dogs? Do you remember that? Do you remember a time, a long, long time ago, when the meanest stray dog on the outskirts of town suddenly had a friend, suddenly seemed approachable, that sort of thing? You might get a yes, still. But this is Seamus Heaney. This is a poem by Seamus Heaney that is very much also a reflection on the dangers of that kind of melancholy, on that kind of nostalgia. And this is called Bogland. I'm going to try my hardest not to read this in his voice, or in an imitation of his voice, like most Irish people, especially most Irish poets, very much including William Butler Yeats. Seamus Heaney was absolutely terrible at reading his own poetry. Absolutely terrible. A quick demonstration of that is easily available if you got him to read a poem of his own out loud and then to read a poem of anybody else, anybody in the world. Cavafy. It doesn't have to be an Irish poet. All of a sudden you would hear a completely different way of doing it. The Irish sometimes take to a morbid extreme the English disaffection with blowing your own horn. So there's definitely, when an Irish poet reads their own poetry out loud to a crowd, there is, no matter how many Nobel Prizes they have under their belt, a very distinct tone of embarrassment and reluctance. The attitude is like Eavan Boland was the same way. The attitude is, well, it almost sounds to your ear like, well, if we're going to be reading poetry, surely we should be reading other people's poetry and not mine. And I'm going to try not to do that. Other people have read Seamus Heaney wonderfully, so I'm not one of them. But I can at least do a better job than he did, I think. This is called Bogland, and it is, at least on the surface, about Irish bogs, which are an amazing ecosystem, a kind of ecosystem that you really should experience. They are a first cousin once removed to the salt marshes of the American Northeast, but they have a character of their own that salt marshes don't have. We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. Everywhere the eye concedes to encroaching horizon, is wooed into the cyclops eye of a tarn. Our unfenced country is bog that keeps crusting between the sights of the sun. They've taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk up out of the peat, set it up on an astounding crate full of air. Butter, sunk under more than 100 years, was recovered salty and white. The ground itself is a kind black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. They'll never dig coal here, only the waterlogged trunks of great firs, soft as pulp. Our pioneers kept striking inwards and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet center is bottomless. I really like that, of course, for its language. It's not as angry as Boland's work, but sometimes Heaney could be, but not usually. It has a weakness of contemporary poetry that Boland's poetry often doesn't have, which is that it makes an explicit reference to something outside the poem that you'll either know about or won't know about. And if you don't know about it, if you don't know about the display of that exhumed great Irish elk, then so much the worse for you. The poem will be less for you. And that's a shame. Whenever anybody writes that way, Heaney keeps it under control. Modern poets exult in it. They absolutely exult in it. They will write they'll write whole poems about the little blue light that was in the hallway to their childhood bathroom without explaining that that's what they're talking about and leaving out all sorts of connections that might lead you to think anything about it at all. It's an in-joke that you'll either get or you won't get. Either you've done hashish with the author and they've made mention of that childhood memory, or they haven't. If they have and you remember it, then you'll be the one black-clad, turtleneck-wearing person in the audience who nods knowingly when you hear that poem in the Cantab Lounge. Everyone else will just go, well, it must be brilliant because I don't understand it. Which is the attitude that poetry has somehow managed to legitimize in the 21st century. It must be great because I don't understand it. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Irish poets tend not to do that. They tend not to be that way. The most famous and, I think, greatest example of an Irish poet who exalts in the difficulty of his poetry would be Paul Muldoon, who is also represented in this book. Good luck trying to understand a Paul Muldoon poem on your first reading, or without ancillary reading. But Heaney almost never does that, and I think that's an indicator of why he was so popular. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing lesser about that. Despite what modern poetry has taught all of its acolytes, comprehensibility, accessibility is not a dirty thing. But one way or another, you don't want to get me. I'm going to rant too much on contemporary poetry because I'm too busy praising. There's plenty of contemporary poetry in this volume, and almost all of it is wonderful. So your Penguin Classic today is an overwhelming recommend. I don't want to go on for an hour about Irish poetry, but this is an overwhelming recommend. If you, the tired old saw used to be, if you see only one movie this year, let it be Jaws 2. And that sometimes critics import that saw over to book reading, which is absolutely ridiculous. If you read only one book this year, you're not a reader. There's no business talking to you about it. But if you're on a budget, or if you're not sure where to turn, or if you don't want to splurge on the five different books that have been mentioned here, if you want a big, generous anthology of Irish poetry, you're not going to do any better than this. And this is a beautiful Penguin volume, too. So your Penguin today is a very strong recommend. And who knows what we'll encounter tomorrow? It is, I am assuring you, random chance that we encountered a volume of poetry for Poetry Tuesday. I don't know what we'll encounter tomorrow. Maybe it'll be 10 books by the same author. We'll find out together. I'm not looking ahead myself. So I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll do a Daily Penguin tomorrow, and who knows what we'll encounter. Will it be more Irish literature? God help us all. I don't know. We'll find out then. I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.